Nathalie Paarlberg, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ro.
Uh, you're an art historian running operations for Turquoise Mountain in Afghanistan. Now, before we go into the details of your work, just give us a background about yourself.
Sure. Well, I started off as a theologian, so I studied theology in the UK for my bachelor's, and only then did a master's in art history. I then had a brief stint as a investment banker, as everyone tends to do, before I saw the light and realized that that was not going to give me long-term fulfillment. So I quit my job in the city in London and went back to university, and that's actually when I started
Did
specializing.
you did you crash the economy?
It wasn't me. It wasn't me. It had crashed before. I was just there
Okay.
trying to pick up the pieces, quite unsuccessfully. So I went back to the drawing board, went back to university, and then started specializing in, I would say, Central Asia, the Middle East, the Persian, Turkish world, however you want to call it, and started learning Farsi, Hindi, started spending more time in that part of the world, and kind of via that route ended up in Afghanistan and then with Turquoise Mountain, but very much an art historian at heart,
Mhm.
and still trying to, and obviously this job that I do now allows me to nurture that passion, even though I'm more in day-to-day operations. Um,
How did that kind of interest happen? You could have easily been interested, I don't know, about art in South America or I don't know, somewhere else. What was it about that part of the world that made you, that is what I'm interested in? That's why I'm really fascinated.
Well, it started when I was doing my bachelor's in theology. I specialized in Hinduism, and so that kind of focused me on India, on South Asia. And when I quit my job in the city and went back to university, and kind of what really made me tick, I did go back to Hinduism initially. Thought that's something that I found really interesting. So I started looking at that region initially, but then gradually started to move west. So starting with Hindi, then I did Urdu, then I did Farsi, and um, a bit lame, but a lot of my decisions have been influenced by kind of pulp fiction. So when I decided to start study theology in the first place, that was because I read the Da Vinci Code, and
Oh, okay.
actually the Kite Runner was I read the Kite Runner was when I was, I don't know, maybe 19, and so I had this image of Afghanistan, but I think an image of Afghanistan that a lot of people have that never been there, kind of violent but beautiful, and the Buddhas of Bamiyan and Rumi and mysticism, but also war and the Taliban, of course. But I did have that in the back of my mind. So when I went back to university, initially focusing on South Asia, but gradually moving west, I think that interest in Afghanistan was always there. And it's just such a fascinating region when it comes to art history or religious traditions. And often the two are, of course, are very linked, but there's Islam, there are Buddhist traditions, there are Hindu traditions, and they, both religious and artistic traditions. And there's Zoroastrian. There's so much to look at. It's such a, I mean, the region's been called a crossroads
Yeah.
for a reason. So there's so much to look at. And I think, if you have an interest in religion and in art and in that part of the world, it's incredibly fascinating.
And then you joined Turquoise Mountain. So talk about Turquoise Mountain because it's got such a started with a focus on Afghanistan. Now it's kind of expanded doing working in other places as well.
Yeah, so we started in Afghanistan in 2006, really with the restoration of the old city of Kabul. And for many years, that was our home. And then in 2015, we started in Myanmar, and afterwards in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Palestine now. So we've really grown across the Middle East and Asia. And our mission is to support artisans with what they need to thrive and so that they can pass on their traditions to the next generation. And we really do that in whatever way is needed. So we end up taking a very wide variety of activities from skills training to connecting artisans to markets to exhibitions. And that's what makes the job and the work so fascinating. Fundamentally, what we do, the work is about cultural heritage, and heritage is what makes a place or a community special. So, whenever we start somewhere, I guess that's one of the first questions that we ask. What makes a particular place, a site, a building special? What makes a community special? What makes them tick? And so that's the beauty of being able to work in this field, and especially in some of the countries in which we work, is that we're able to engage with everything that you just mentioned, the things that set a country or a place um, apart in terms of beauty, in terms of value, in terms of whether that's the the tile work on a minaret, or whether that's hand woven carpets or um, mother of pearl inlay. So it is about, it's not always necessarily about beauty, but beauty plays a
Yeah.
big role. Um, but I think if I can take this into a slightly different direction, I also think that is what makes what makes the approach of the organization quite unique in the wider development setting of the countries in which we work. Most development starts by analyzing, what is not there, what is missing, what do people need,
Mm.
and through my work, we're actually able to turn that upside down. We look, what is there? What is valuable to people? What is special about this place or this community? And about appreciating that and building on that. So the work really starts from an asset rather than from something that is lacking. And I think that's a very special, but also a very fulfilling way to engage with the countries in which we're active, because the countries in which we work, unfortunately, are often known more widely because of war, because of conflict. There's a quite often a quite well, one-sided image of the places in which we work, and we're able to work with those other aspects of the country.
What is art in Afghanistan? I mean, how would you introduce Afghan art to the world? What is it that stands out? I mean, is there something that you could define? Afghanistan in modern times is not known for art, right?
No, and I'm more in the field of cultural heritage, so I tend to look at things that are not necessarily contemporary. We work with a lot of craftsmen and women who, of course, in there are artisans. Um, but is there such a thing as Afghan art? I think there are many Afghan artistic traditions throughout the centuries, um, many Afghan crafts, whether that's carpet weaving, calligraphy, miniature painting, um, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the Buddha images in the National Museum, but also the Nuristani wood carving. All of that has a role to play in the
Mm.
mosaic that is Afghan art um, and craft. But is there one thing that defines Afghan art? Um, it's so incredibly diverse, but that's also what makes it so beautiful.
If we were to kind of roll out an Afghan map in front of you, and if you were to give us an artistic or heritage kind of tour of the country, be a tour guide to us, so, okay, let's start from the south, going northward or westward. So just give us that, just imagine the map of Afghanistan is laid out before you. Which part of the country is known for what? The history. Am I
Yeah,
putting it the right way?
yeah, I think so. I think first of all, when it comes to so most of the buildings in Afghanistan to this day are made of, soil and water, mud
Yeah,
brick,
yeah.
which is a material that nature tends to reclaim. So in terms of monumental buildings and architecture, you don't actually find a lot of that outside of the urban centers of Afghanistan. So Herat in the west, Mazar-e-Sharif, Balkh in the north, Kabul, Kandahar in the south. And even there's a lot of variety. Herat, for example, was always part, or for a long time of its history, was part of Persian empires or empires who had their their source of power in Iran. And that's very visible in the architecture of the city, but also in the artistic traditions that came out of the city. So miniature painting, calligraphy, stonework. Then if you go to the north,
Turquoise tiles.
exactly, tile work, glass blowing is still a craft that's practiced in Herat. Then if you go to the north, um, I think it's good to realize that before the Salang Tunnel, the north and the south of Afghanistan were really quite separated from each other by the Hindu Kush.
Yes, yeah.
Wasn't actually that easy to travel between the two for 6 months of the year. And um, although, of course, people were moving around and people have always been moving around, the North was very much, um, the domain of Turkmen and Uzbek communities that had fled from the Central Asian countries after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and had settled in Afghanistan. And they are and were they were but still are incredible weavers of carpets.
Yeah.
So that's something that you find in the north. You also find that now in Bamiyan and in Herat, but the north is really, the heartland of carpet weaving in Afghanistan. In the south, it's embroidery. And again, you also find embroidery within Hazara communities in the Central Highlands. But the embroidery traditions of Kandahar, Kamak embroidery, are incredibly special. You don't really find them anywhere else. Then Nuristan in
Oh,
the
yeah.
east, the wood carving traditions of Nuristan, you don't find those elsewhere in Afghanistan. So definitely every region has its own craft and artistic traditions.
Yeah, you can almost kind of, cut Afghanistan into different artistic kind of, historical and heritage pieces. Because, I mean, you're talking about the South. One of the things really fascinates me is the color in the South, right? Especially the color of the Kochi women, the way they do their dresses. I mean, it's just a fascinating amalgamation of colors, artistic ingenuity. So,
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, that is also very visible in Afghanistan. People speak different languages in Afghanistan. They have their own oral traditions. They have their own written traditions. The different communities have different ways of adorning their bodies. So Turkmen jewelry, for example, is very heavy, big, bold silver pieces. That is different again from jewelry that you would find in the south of the country. The same goes um, for women and men's dress, where embroidery again plays a big role. So the type of embroidery that is done in the north of Afghanistan by mainly Uzbek communities has a very different look and feel than the fine Kamak embroidery of the south in Kandahar. And what I like is that you still see those crafts as being very much alive. I was in Kandahar last year, and you see men on motorcycles in their Perana Tumban with this beautiful embroidery on their shirts
and the hats.
and the skull caps exactly, or on the shawls that they wear above on top of their hats. So all of that is visible in everyday life in Afghanistan, and it provides a very kind of, creates an identity and a feel for the different places that one would go to.
And there's also been kind of Afghanistan's blooded, um, at least modern history has been kind of, one of the things that people have not really thought about is preserving heritage sites. Um, so the last, just talk about the last 4 decades of damage that, have been done to
Yeah.
Afghanistan's heritage and heritage sites and artifacts.
I think, and it's different for different places because the last 4 decades of war have affected different places in a very different way. The Soviet war was one that was mainly fought out in rural areas. But let's say if we take Kabul, when Turquoise Mountain started working there in the early 2000s, there was not much left of historic Kabul. Large parts of the city had been burned down by the British in the mid 19th century during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, so the Old Bazaar and other neighborhoods. Then from about 1948, there was this modernization craze, and the Kabul municipality set out to modernize Kabul and created these master plans, and entire neighborhoods were just razed to the grounds to create modern city blocks. But it was the civil war of the 90s that I think destroyed an estimated 70% of the urban fabric of Kabul. So by the time that, after 2001, there just wasn't that much left. And the part where we started working in Kabul, in Murad Khani, was this pocket that miraculously had survived all these different periods, although in a very bad shape. But it was a part of the city that had been given to the Kizilbash community. And because the Kizilbash supported the British during the Anglo-Afghan wars, when the army of retribution set fire to Kabul city, they purposely spared the Kizilbash quarters. And
Ah,
that's why that bit survived. And then when, the master plan for Kabul was created, Murad Khani was on that map. It was about to be razed to the ground. But then the Soviet war happened and there just weren't the resources to actually implement the plan. So it survived that. And then with the Civil War, it was caught in the crossfires of these warlords shooting at each other. And that left it incredibly damaged, but it was still there. It hadn't been razed to the ground. No one had put a shopping mall on top of the 19th century courtyards. So, that was Kabul. But other parts of the country, like Bamiyan, for example, cultural heritage sites were mined. So incredibly hard to visit, incredibly hard to work there. And so it took years of demining before anyone could actually start to look at preservation and conservation of these sites. So it's a varied picture throughout the country.
and you've got the minaret in Ruhr.
Yes.
I'd be grateful if you could give us as as much as you can a sense of history of these
Yeah.
sites that you understand.
Well, all these sites are connected to different parts of Afghanistan's history. So if the old city of Kabul that I was just talking about is very much part of the history of the Durrani Empire, of Timur Shah, who moved the capital from Kandahar to Kabul at the end of the 18th century, the Minaret of Jam is part of the Ghorid Empire that ruled over Afghanistan, I think the 10th, 11th century. I'm not 100% sure. But that was a huge empire that really extended into the Middle East and then towards India. And as its capital, it had this city called Firuzkoh, Turquoise Mountain. And the minaret of Jam is the only thing that remains of that capital.
Now I've an idea
There
of
you
where
go.
that name came from, and a certain Rory Stewart walked across it.
Absolutely. And the minaret's hard to reach. It's right in the middle of Afghanistan, in the mountains. Um, the river runs right past it.
Yes.
So whenever there's flooding, everyone, gets into a panic because there's the fear that, you know, it will drag along the minaret with it. But that's part of the Ghorid Empire. And then if you move further west to Herat, when we look at the minarets that are there, that is part of the Timurid Empire. So
Yeah.
that's more 15th century, and Shah Rukh and Gowar Shad, who moved the capital of the Timurid Empire from Samarkand to Herat and really built this incredible city. So different. We're working on a caravanserai right now in the Bamiyan Valley that is 17th century and really speaks to the period of travel between Safavid Iran and Mughal India, and Bamiyan being kind of the route between those two powerhouses. So the story of Afghanistan, it can be told through these different buildings, but also through the different traditions that are associated with these sites. Because if we talk about the minarets in Herat, they're covered in, glazed tiles, as you say. So
Yeah,
that is again a craft tradition. When we look at the old city of Kabul, that's mud brick, but also wood carving using cedar and walnut. So
yeah.
um, a building also contains a lot of what we would call intangible cultural heritage. So those are the traditions, the knowledge, the crafts that are associated with a particular community, and that are used to create these buildings.
Um, last time we spoke, you talked about, which I didn't know. I mean, the first human embodiment of the Buddha. I
Hmm.
didn't know about that. And the discovery of the first oil painting, I knew about that. But
Yeah.
just give us a perspective, a history of that.
I think, I mean, and it goes to the point that you just mentioned. People know Afghanistan because of war, because of everything that's been going on in the last 40 years. And so what gets glossed over is that Afghanistan actually is an incredible source of culture and rich artistic traditions throughout the centuries. And the oil painting that you mentioned, when I was studying art history, I was taught that oil painting was a discovery of the Northern Renaissance, something that happened here in the Netherlands, where I'm from. Jan van Eyck discovered, oil painting and managed to perfect it. It turns out that, what is it, 7 centuries before the Northern Renaissance, oil painting was being used for the caves around the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And they found in those caves traces of oil painting dating from the 17th century. But the scholars researching that also found that the painting was so sophisticated that it must have existed way before the 7th century. Um, so we're not quite sure how it developed there, whether it was developed in Afghanistan or whether it was developed in kind of in the broader region and was used in Afghanistan. But definitely the earliest datable example of oil painting that we have is in Bamiyan in Afghanistan. And then when it comes to the image of the Buddha in human form, again, the earliest image that we have of the Buddha in human form that can be dated was found in Afghanistan in 1830 by Charles Masson in Bimaran, which is a village west of Jalalabad. And he found this golden reliquary, like relic box
Yeah.
inside a stupa that shows the Buddha flanked by the Hindu gods Indra and Brahma as attendants. And four coins were laying next to it, and those four coins dated from the first century AD. So we know that that image, that Buddha image, cannot be older than the first century AD. But what's quite interesting is that that is still 5 to 6 centuries after the death of the Buddha. And so for that entire period, half a millennium, the Buddha was never represented in human form. Early Buddhists, Theravada Buddhists, were quite ascetic. They saw art as a luxury, as an indulgence, and something that, you shouldn't engage with. And the Buddha was someone who, had struggled, I guess, his whole life to escape his physical form. And so he was never depicted as a human. He was depicted using symbols, so his footprints, the tree under which he reached enlightenment. And all of a sudden, boom, 500 years later, we find this image of the Buddha in human form with a top knot in, a sort of toga, holding up his hand, saying, be at peace. And it was found in Afghanistan. Again, how do you explain that? And like, two things there. One is that older form of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, started to make way for a different type of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism around kind of the first century. Um, And under Mahayana Buddhism, wealth was more acceptable as long as it was shared. So you saw an enormous uptick in sponsorship of monasteries, of stupas, and they, of course, have to be embellished. So there was kind of that impetus for more artistic expression. And at the same time, you had the rise of the Kushan Empire. Now, the Kushans are the descendants of these Central Asian nomads, the USE, who crossed the Oxus River, kind of came into Afghanistan. I think most scholars believe that they were the ones who made the Bactrian Hoard, this incredible
Yeah.
collection of golden artifacts that was found in northern Afghanistan. So they migrated through Afghanistan and then ended up settling in India where they converted to Buddhism. And they built this empire that effectively encompassed what we now call the Silk Road. And so I think it's these two things. And their culture was one where they kind of seamlessly blended Persia, Rome, China, and India. And I think it's that kind of very syncretic culture with that kind of with those developments in Buddhism that were more favorable to the development of art that sit behind this kind of coming into being of the Buddha in human form.
And I
Um,
suppose, for you as a historian, just imagine kind of standing on a hill in Bamiyan, looking at it and having had that historic knowledge. It must be very exciting to feel yourself standing there with all the histories crisscrossing each other
it's
throughout history.
incredible. It's incredible. And also the contrast, right? Because if you go to Bamiyan now, it feels like you've reached the end of the earth, right? It feels like a hard to reach outpost. But then to imagine that all those centuries ago, it was not a hard to reach outpost, it was the throbbing heart of what we now call the Silk Road, where people, ideas, techniques were shared and developed. I think that contrast is very, very powerful.
Now, in one of the previous episodes, we had Professor Clevelyn Morgan,
Mm.
the author of the Buddha's Bamiyan. He gave us a very good a history of the Bamiyan Valley and where the Buddhas stood. But the monasteries, the damage that have been done to the caves where there used to be the monasteries, due to extreme level of poverty in recent decades, pushing people upwards towards the mountainside and then pushing them into the caves.
Mhm.
And with the fire, the smoke, and the damage that they have caused. So, talk about that.
So I think, well, a lot of the monasteries in the Bamiyan Valley would have been made, like most things in Afghanistan, from mud bricks. So a lot of those, I think, have just been reclaimed by nature, and there's nothing left of them. The caves, of course, are hewn out into the stone wall, and that's why they're still there. And they have seen a lot of damage throughout the centuries. As you mentioned, people, fled into the caves during the Soviet war. Then when the Taliban came, would cook their food, the smoke would cover um, the paintings in a layer of soot. The Taliban has also defaced the Buddhas, has painted over some, but I mean, I think it's still quite remarkable how much there actually is still there and in so much detail, and the colors are still, bright. They're reds and blues and yellows and oranges. You can see these garlands of seated Buddha figures, hands in their laps, with their top buns. So I think there's actually still a lot there to be seen and to be studied and to be researched, despite the damage that has been sustained over the course
And
of the.
people are still living in those caves.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think UNESCO has sealed off caves with paintings, but I mean, there are so many caves, and a lot of them have been exposed now because the
The erosion.
erosion exactly. So caves that wouldn't have been visible are now, yeah, the wind can get into them, rain and so on, and so of course this does not help
But
the
of course,
preservation.
Bamiyan itself is unique in itself in the region because everywhere you look at, there's some sort of, heritage side. You've got the Shah for example. You've got the different artifacts in other parts of the valley. So, what is the situation now? I mean, the previous Taliban rule we know, but what is the situation now?
Specifically when it comes to cultural heritage,
Yeah,
yeah, I think the after 2021, the de facto authorities, they've been quite supportive of a lot of cultural heritage work. I know of organizations that have worked on a Buddhist stupa on the synagogue in Herat, and the Taliban have been very, very supportive of this. As I mentioned, we are currently working on a caravanserai in the Bamiyan Valley, and we're very much able to do that. I think a side note that needs to be made here is that when the Taliban came into power in the 1990s, they were also supportive of cultural heritage. We have this image, the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan was such an iconic image. I think everyone has seen, pictures or the video, and then everything that happened in the National Museum with the Minister of Culture and the Minister of Finance, walking through the museum, smashing all the statues. But that glosses over the fact that that happened in 2001. The Taliban came into power years before that. And they were the ones who actually reopened the museum after the Civil War. They took care of the collection. 70% of the collection of the National Museum had disappeared during the Civil War. It'd been looted, been plundered, sold into um, sold into Pakistan to traders all over the world. So they took care of the collection. They reopened the museum, invited important people. When there's this anecdote about a Taliban commander, I think in the Bamiyan Valley, when the Taliban first took Bamiyan, shooting at the Bamiyan Buddha, and he immediately was told to stop. And Mullah Omar issued, I think, up to 10 decrees saying, no, cultural heritage, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, they need to be protected. Also with an eye on tourism, which, sounds a bit ambitious maybe at the time. But something changed because then there was this announcement in early 2001 that all these idolatrous images had to be destroyed. So right now, there is support for cultural heritage work, but it's obviously not a guarantee that it will stay like that. And I also think it's important to note that, music has been banned. The Festival of Nowruz has been banned. And these are not, the Buddhists of Bamiyan were huge. They were iconic. People knew about them. It's very tangible. But these, music, um, the New Year's festival, this
they
is
used to
eating.
do Dambura festival in Bamiyan.
Yeah. So that's forbidden, but that's also part of Afghan culture, and it's also part of cultural heritage. But it's not. It's what we call in the sector intangible cultural heritage. And I think the danger with that is that it generates less media attention, right? It's less dramatic. Something is forbidden and it kind of dies a slow death.
Yeah.
There's not this one moment of a huge statue being blown up. There are no photographs of the museum with bits of statue and debris everywhere. So I think it's a mixed picture in terms of, the state of cultural heritage in Afghanistan at the moment.
But now let's talk about your personal story of Afghanistan. You've done a book. I mean, if it's a cliche. Don't judge a book by its cover. I definitely judge that book by its cover because it's such an amazing cover as well. But sadly, um, I can't have that book because it's not in English.
No, it's in
Talk about the
Dutch.
book.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Your Eyes Are Beautiful in Dutch. And of course that
And how
refers,
would you say that in Dutch?
Je ogen zijn mooi.
That's what I've learned.
Yeah. But I think, what it means in Persian, just chashmayat makbulas.
Yes,
Um, and do you want to explain what that means, or do you want me to have a go?
I want you to have a go.
Okay. So, and I think again, this is part of the beauty of Afghanistan, just the poetry that's, runs through daily life
Yeah.
and language. Because if you give a compliment to someone in Afghanistan in Persian language, in Dari or in Farsi, for example, gosh, you're wearing a beautiful shirt. You wouldn't just say thank you. You would tell me that my eyes are beautiful.
Yeah.
And the idea behind, I mean, it's part of what in the Persian language is called tarof, which,
Yes.
it's a very formal, a polite way of engaging with each other, which also means that you can't just say hello. You have to have a 10-minute conversation where I ask you about the
Yeah,
state
when
of
you
your
say
soul,
someone
your
you
health, and
yeah, when you say someone you're beautiful, is that your eye sees beautiful.
yeah, your eyes see beautiful. So the idea is that it's not your shirt that is beautiful because that would be a bit arrogant. No, it's my eyes that have the ability to see beauty wherever I look. And so that very much was the idea behind the book. What do we see when we look with beautiful eyes at Afghanistan? And I started writing after the fall of Kabul. I had left Afghanistan with my husband and my son 2 years prior to that in 2019. We were living in Myanmar at the time. And I think for a lot of people who had lived and worked in Afghanistan, we felt such a sense of powerlessness. We wanted to help, but what could we do? And at the same time, the images of Afghanistan that were flooding the news at that time, people rushing to the airport, reinforced this idea about Afghanistan as a land that just everyone wanted to leave. That was horrid. And that was just not the Afghanistan that I had come to know in the years that I had lived there. Because of my work, I was able to engage with Afghanistan through beauty, through creativity, working with artisans, with artists. And so I think at that time, I just started writing, and I started to, maybe it was a desire to put on paper that world that we thought might disappear, because we had no idea at the time, of course, what would happen next. The Taliban was back, but that's all we knew. So maybe out of a desire to preserve this Afghanistan as I knew it, and also to do something to process everything that was happening, I had started to write, really not with the intention of writing a book per se or publishing something. But then, of course, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, I had so much material that I thought I want to do something with this. So that's how eventually the book came into being. And it really looks at the 8 years that I've spent working and living in Afghanistan from 2016 to 2024. So back when Afghanistan was still a hot spot of, development work, and Kabul was the Las Vegas of international aid. The war was still going on to the time and the years after 2021 when the Taliban was back in power. The war was over, and it was again a new situation. So yeah, it's a very personal book. It's very much about my experience of Afghanistan, but also very much about the beauty of Afghanistan, about
Does
ambitions.
does Pulisur feature on that book?
It does not. No, I haven't done it. I haven't comprehensively covered everything. I've not traveled much to the south. I've only been to
No, I
Kandahar.
mean Pulisur in Kabul.
Police, I know, but I've not been there.
Really?
Uh,
Oh, because that's how much I know about Kabul. So now, there's this Kabul has got this John thing. Not many people have been able to put a finger on to say, when you talk about Kabul John,
mhm.
this is what I mean. So,
Yeah.
what does it mean for you? What is Kabul John for you?
I mean, it's interesting. The moment I landed for the first time in Kabul in 2016, I knew that that was where I had to be at that point in my life. And I think for me personally, the years prior to going to Kabul, were very much marked by me trying to find my way in life. A few years, my brother had died
Oh, sorry.
unexpectedly when he was 18. Um, I went into banking, I left banking. I was quite lost and I didn't quite know where to go. And gradually I found my way in life again, I think. And then that culminated in coming to Afghanistan. And for me, immediately it felt like the place where not only I wanted to be, but I needed to be at that point in my life. And it was a very, I mean, it still is, but it's a very special, I mean, one, it's beautiful, surrounded by these mountains with their snow caps. And then, for all its problems, but coming there as a 20 something year old into this world where everyone was doing something interesting. Everyone was there, foreigners were there because they wanted to be there. So everyone was very passionate. It was so different from this banking world that I had left in gray Europe. But after Kabul fell, of course, things changed. And I know a lot of expats who had lived in Kabul and now really do not want to come back. They don't want that image of Kabul that they have of Kabul John, the way
Yeah.
they have Kabul John in their heart, to be tarnished by what's happening now. But I have gone back, and actually going back helped me to also build a relationship with the city and with the country that is not just the bubble of the years prior to 2021. And I still think Kabul holds its charm, however ephemeral that is. Is it the people, the buildings, the
So you
mountain?
think there's still pulse in the John of Kabul?
Absolutely. There is still pulse in the John of Kabul.
Oh, that's a beautiful way of putting it, isn't it? There's a pulse in the John of Kabul. Now, if you were to kind of share stories about that kind of, that stands out for you, whether it is funny, amusing, whatever you want to put it, that you want to share, what would that be, the standout moment that you think that is Afghanistan for me? That is, that will stay with me.
Oh gosh. I mean, there's so many stories, but I think, I mean, one, so when my son, I became, well, my husband and I met in the Netherlands, but he went with me to Kabul and I fell pregnant. And when my son was 2 months old, I delivered in the Netherlands, but when he was 2 months old, we brought him back to Afghanistan. And raising a newborn in, the concrete jungle of the green zone, but in Kabul more widely, I think was just a really special experience because I was able to connect with my Afghan colleagues, with a lot of the Afghan friends and people around me in a very different way all of a sudden, as a mother to mother. And so I remember one Nowruz, we took my son, who was 6 months at the time, to the old city of Kabul, where there was a big Nowruz celebration. And, Kabul comes to life during Nowruz. It's such a special time. And it's just, Kabul's quite, a lot of it is beige, right? A lot of it is
Yeah,
mud.
yeah, yeah.
And then, you go into a courtyard and it's just an explosion of color. Kites are circling in the air. Girls and boys are dressed in the kind of,
And the smog is easing off a bit.
yeah, exactly. The smog is easing off and people are dressed in bright pinks and greens. There's music, there are performances, um, and being able to take him there. And of course, within, 15 minutes, he was married off to another baby girl.
As it
The
happened.
challah, yeah, we had a challah who helped us take care of him. She had found him a bride, and he was wearing a lot of jewelry at the time, as a 6 month baby does, to ward off the evil eye.
Yeah.
And his challah had given him a gold ring,
Hmm.
again, to ward off the evil eye. So when he had found, she had found him a bride and he was introduced to his, mother-in-law to be, and who was initially really pleased, but then she saw the gold ring on his finger and then said, well, the wedding is off because apparently, and I did not know this, but people in Afghanistan believe that gold causes impotence in men.
Really?
That's what I've been
I...
told. So the next day, the gold ring was gone and he had a silver one. So those are just,
Oh.
some of the small happy interactions of, daily life in Kabul with a newborn. And there's so many like that. But yeah, it's a very special place.
And the food?
Yes, never enough.
Did you manage to learn to cook? You know,
No, no, I'm not a cook. My husband cooks. Um, and he has learned how to cook. Because we've also been so disappointed with Afghan food here in the Netherlands because they try and adapt it to a
taste.
Western taste. So the Kabuli pulao is not greasy enough. There's no croûte. Um, but yeah, that was of course parts
There's
of
no
the joy.
Landi.
Yeah, exactly. So my husband from time to time, not often enough, tries his hand at a good pulao.
Oh, on that note, kind of I'm drooling now, just wishing kind of, a bit of a plate of palau appears somewhere by magic. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thoroughly enjoyed it, learned an enormous amount, and thank you also for all the amazing work that you're all doing.
Thank you so much, Ro. Really appreciate it and great
Great.
to chat with you.
Thank you.